The sun was still low over the suburban lake, its golden light bouncing gently across the water when David Carter cast his fishing line, a ritual he had carried from his childhood. Fishing wasn't just a hobby for him, it was peace, a reminder of summers spent with his grandfather on riverbanks where no one questioned whether he belonged. That morning, the ripples on the water were soothing, the quiet broken only by birdsong and the faint click of his reel. But serenity shattered when a sharp voice sliced through the air. "Excuse me." A woman in oversized sunglasses and a stiff polo shirt stormed down the HOA walkway, clipboard clutched like a weapon. David sighed. Inwardly, he knew the type. "You can't fish here," she snapped, pointing toward the water as if the lake itself was offended. David raised an eyebrow, calm but firm. "Ma'am, I'm a resident. I pay the same fees as everyone else here. The lake's for the neighborhood, isn't it?" She sneered, her lips tightening. "Not without a permit. And I don't recall seeing your name on the list." Her emphasis on your carried more venom than she thought she was hiding. David reeled in slowly, refusing to rise to the bait. "There was no permit required in the guidelines I signed when I bought my home." She smirked as if savoring the moment. "Well, the HOA updated the rules. You should have read the fine print." With a flourish, she pulled a paper from her clipboard and handed it to him. It was an official violation notice, a fine of $500 for unauthorized use of HOA-managed waters. Around them, a few neighbors watched from their porches, some smirking, some shifting uncomfortably. David's jaw tightened, the paper crumpling slightly in his grip. It wasn't the money. It was the principle. He paid his dues like everyone else, yet somehow he was singled out. "This is ridiculous," he said, handing the paper back. But she only smiled, tilting her head with a smug superiority. "Rules are rules. If you can't follow them, maybe this neighborhood isn't the right fit for you." With that, she turned and strutted away, heels clicking like punctuation marks to her arrogance. David stared at the lake, his blood simmering beneath his calm exterior. They thought they could push him out, make him feel like an outsider in his own home. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The fine notice should have been the end of it, a petty attempt at intimidation that David could have paid and forgotten. But the HOA wasn't interested in fairness. They were interested in control. Within a week, another letter arrived at his door, this one citing him for improper storage of fishing equipment visible from the street. David stared at it in disbelief. His fishing pole had been leaning neatly against the side of his garage, hardly an eyesore compared to the rusting lawn furniture on his neighbor's porch. He crumpled the letter and tossed it in the trash, but the message was clear. They weren't going to stop. By the third week, his mailbox had become a pipeline of harassment, citations for grass too long, when it wasn't warnings for noise, when his evenings were spent quietly reading, even a complaint about his nephew's bicycle left on the driveway for less than an hour. The fines stacked higher, each one dripping with the HOA's smug signature. The woman with the clipboard, Mrs. Cranston, HOA president, made it her personal mission to enforce every fabricated violation with a smile that barely masked her malice. At neighborhood meetings, David noticed the way she whispered to others, the subtle nods, the smirks. He wasn't just being fined for fishing. He was being targeted, singled out, and some of the residents were enjoying the spectacle. But not all. A few neighbors pulled him aside, quietly apologizing for what was happening. "They've never gone after anyone like this before," one man muttered, eyes darting nervously toward Mrs. Cranston. "But they won't let go once they start. They think they can break you." David nodded, saying nothing, but inside, a storm was brewing. He'd worked too hard for too long to be pushed around by people who measured power with fines and paperwork. One evening, as he sat at his kitchen table flipping through yet another violation notice, he caught his reflection in the window. He saw the frustration in his own eyes, but beneath it was something else, resolve. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Don't fight them on their terms. Change the game." That was it. The HOA thought they controlled the lake, the heart of the neighborhood, the place where families gathered and children played. They thought withholding it would push him out. But David had been doing his research quietly, learning about the land deeds and the strange history of the community's development. And what he found made him smile for the first time in weeks. The lake wasn't HOA owned at all. It was privately held, and the owner was aging, tired of the constant maintenance. David's hands tightened around the papers, a plan forming in his mind. They wanted to make him feel like an outsider here. Fine, he would own the very thing they used to control him. And when he did, every smug grin, every fine, every insult would come back to them with interest. David spent the next few weeks moving in silence, the way he always did when business required precision. While the HOA piled fines at his doorstep, he pored over property records, zoning maps, and legal documents, confirming what he had discovered. The lake at the center of the neighborhood wasn't managed or owned by the HOA. It belonged to an elderly man named Mr. Whitaker, who had inherited it decades ago from his father. The HOA had simply negotiated access rights years earlier, tricking residents into thinking the lake was part of their dues. David found Mr. Whitaker's address, a farmhouse outside town, and drove there one Saturday morning. The old man answered the door with tired eyes but a firm handshake. They sat at his kitchen table, the smell of fresh coffee between them, and David got straight to the point. "I'm interested in buying the lake," he said. Mr. Whitaker studied him, curious but not dismissive. "You, the first one to ask me direct," the old man replied. "HOA's been badgering me for years. They want it cheap. Think I don't know what it's worth." David leaned forward. "You do, and I do, and I'll pay fair. More than fair. But if I buy it, I'm not turning it into condos or draining it. I'm preserving it. I grew up fishing with my grandfather. I want this lake to matter." The old man's eyes softened at that. He explained how upkeep had become a burden, how the HOA treated him like an obstacle. "They send me their letters too, like I work for them. I'm sick of it." The negotiations stretched into the afternoon, both men speaking plainly, neither trying to cheat the other. Finally, Mr. Whitaker nodded. "You remind me of my brother. He wouldn't have let people push him around either. I'll sell it to you." The price they agreed upon wasn't cheap, but David had the means, years of disciplined saving investments, and the quiet wealth he never flaunted. By the end of the week, lawyers drafted contracts, papers were signed, and ownership was transferred. David drove home with the deed in his passenger seat, his chest swelling with quiet triumph. For once, the HOA's letters didn't bother him. He stacked them neatly, like a collection of meaningless scraps, because soon they would mean nothing. That evening, he stood by the water's edge, the lake rippling under the setting sun, and felt a surge of power unlike anything before. This wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. They had tried to fine him for fishing here. Now he owned the lake itself. Soon, the same neighbors who cheered as the HOA tormented him would learn a truth they weren't ready for. Every step they took near this water would be because he allowed it, and the ones who had mocked him would pay in ways they never expected. The lake that once symbolized exclusion now belonged to him, and he already knew how he would make them feel it. The HOA board meeting was packed that evening, the air thick with arrogance as residents gathered in the community hall, sipping wine and chatting as though the lake outside was their private inheritance. Susan, the HOA president, stood at the podium like a queen addressing her subjects, reading off a list of new rules with a smug smile. Effective immediately, she declared, fishing without a permit will incur an additional fine of $500. Repeat offenders will face legal action and possible restriction from lake access. The crowd clapped, some whispering excitedly about how this would keep the riffraff out, their eyes cutting toward David in the back row. He sat silently, arms crossed, waiting. When the applause faded, he stood, his tall frame commanding attention. "I've listened to your rules long enough," he said, his voice calm but carrying weight. "But you forgot one detail. As of last week, I own this lake." The room fell into stunned silence. Some chuckled nervously, thinking it was a joke, but David reached into his folder and unfolded the deed, holding it high for all to see. Gasps rippled through the hall, followed by a tense silence. Susan's face flushed red as she stammered, "That's impossible." The HOA has jurisdiction. David cut her off sharply. No, you had access rights. Temporary. But the property itself was never yours. And now it's mine. Which means every boat dock, every fishing line, every picnic by this water happens under my permission. Not yours. Murmurs erupted, residents turning to one another in disbelief. A man in the front row blurted out, "So, what does that mean for us?" David let the silence stretch before answering. "It means if you want to use this lake, you'll pay me. Directly. A yearly fee for access. Higher than your so-called HOA dues. And for those who mocked me, fined me, and treated me like I didn't belong here," his eyes locked on Susan, whose jaw clenched with fury, "your access is revoked. Permanently." The crowd exploded, some shouting in protest, others whispering that maybe he had every right. Susan slammed her fist on the podium, hissing, "You can't do this." David smiled coldly. "I already did." He gathered his papers and walked out, leaving chaos in his wake. Outside, the night air was crisp, the lake glimmering behind him like a crown jewel. For the first time, the neighborhood understood the truth. The man they tried to fine out of existence now controlled the very thing they treasured most. And David knew this was just the beginning. The real reckoning had yet to come. The morning after David posted his signs around the lake, the neighborhood was buzzing with confusion, anger, and disbelief. Families who had grown accustomed to early fishing trips or quiet strolls by the water woke up to bold warnings. Private property, access by permit only. For years, the HOA had made rules, handed out fines, and threatened residents into compliance, but never had they faced a wall like this. And now the wall had a name, David. From his porch, coffee in hand, David watched with quiet satisfaction as neighbors gathered near the entrance path to the lake, pointing at the signs and muttering in frustration. Some were furious, others desperate, and a few even looked guilty, as though they had known this reckoning was inevitable after the way the HOA, led by Susan, had treated him. By mid-morning, Susan herself stormed up his driveway, her face twisted with rage. "You can't do this," she shouted, jabbing a manicured finger toward the signs. David leaned back in his chair, his calmness infuriating her further. "Actually, I can," he replied, lifting the deed from beside him like a shield of truth. "This isn't HOA property, Susan. It's mine. And if people want to use it, they'll need my permission." Susan's voice trembled with a mix of outrage and panic as she hissed, "You'll tear this community apart." David's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice steady as stone. "No, Susan. You already did that the day you turned this neighborhood into your personal kingdom. I'm just making sure you finally pay the price." Behind her, a small crowd had formed. Neighbors who had once nodded along to every HOA demand were now watching with shifting loyalties. Some whispered among themselves, realizing that David had the upper hand, while others shouted at him, accusing him of being selfish. But when David announced that permits would be available at a yearly fee double what the HOA had once charged in dues, silence fell like a heavy blanket. Gasps echoed through the crowd, and Susan's eyes widened in horror. "You're extorting us," she screamed, but David only shrugged. "You extorted me for years with your fines, Susan. Call it poetic justice." The tension rippled through the group as arguments broke out, with some residents blaming Susan directly for targeting David in the first place, while others muttered reluctantly that they would pay the fee rather than lose access to the lake. The neighborhood's identity, its sense of community, its property values, all were tied to the water. To give it up meant to lose the very thing they had been so proud of. And now, all of it was in David's hands. Susan's cheeks burned red as she realized the crowd's anger was no longer directed solely at him. Much of it was pointed at her. "You'll regret this," she spat venomously, but David only offered a small, almost amused smile. "No, Susan," he said softly, yet loud enough for everyone to hear. "I think it's you who regrets underestimating me." The power dynamics of the neighborhood had shifted overnight, and though Susan tried to hold her ground, the cracks in her authority were widening. David sipped his coffee and watched her retreat in humiliation, knowing that this was only the beginning of the downfall of the HOA. For years, he had been treated like an outsider in his own home. But now, for the first time, the neighborhood realized that the man they tried to crush held the very heart of their community in his hands, and he had no intention of letting it go easily. The weeks following David's bold move were nothing short of transformative for the neighborhood, and the cracks in the HOA's power widened with every passing day. Residents who once feared Susan's wrath now had a new focus: the lake permits. Lines formed at David's door, not out of respect at first, but out of necessity. Parents who wanted to take their children fishing, couples who wanted to enjoy evening strolls by the water, and retirees who had counted on peaceful mornings with a rod and reel, all reluctantly accepted that they would now need to deal with David directly. He charged fairly but firmly, ensuring that the permits generated enough income to not only maintain the lake, but also remind everyone that access was no longer a right handed down by an HOA board, but a privilege controlled by the man they once mocked and fined. The tension was palpable at the next HOA meeting, where Susan stood at the front of the room. Her once commanding presence diminished as murmurs filled the crowd. "This is unacceptable," she barked, trying to sound authoritative. "We cannot allow one man to hold this community hostage." But the crowd was no longer blindly loyal. Homeowners raised their hands one after another, questioning why the HOA had ever picked a fight with David in the first place, reminding Susan that she had been the one to fine him for something as harmless as fishing. "He's only doing what you did to him," one neighbor muttered loudly, and the room erupted in agreement. Susan's face reddened as she struggled to regain control, but the truth was undeniable. Her authority was slipping. Meanwhile, David, sitting quietly in the back of the meeting, leaned forward just enough to let his presence be known. His calm confidence contrasted with Susan's frantic attempts at control, and the visual alone spoke volumes. By the time the meeting adjourned, several residents had approached David, not with hostility, but with respect, acknowledging that he had outsmarted the very institution that had bullied so many of them. Over the following days, some even began suggesting disbanding the HOA altogether, arguing that it served no real purpose other than enforcing arbitrary rules. This shift rattled Susan deeply. She began sending angry letters, threats of legal action, even desperate attempts to paint David as the villain in local community groups online. But the tide had turned. Screenshots of her petty fines, stories of her harassment, and videos of her angry outbursts circulated among neighbors, while David's steady hand and fair policies earned him quiet admiration. He had not only broken the HOA's grip on the lake, but had also begun dismantling its hold on the neighborhood spirit. For the first time in years, people saw the possibility of living free from Susan's tyranny, and that possibility was intoxicating. David had sparked something far bigger than revenge. He had ignited a movement. By the end of the summer, the transformation was complete. What began as an HOA fine meant to humiliate David had exploded into a full-scale power shift that no one could have predicted. The lake, once the crown jewel of the HOA's rule, was now a symbol of resistance, owned outright by the man they tried to silence. On weekends, families who had once paid the HOA with resentment now happily paid David for their permits, knowing that every dollar went into the upkeep of the lake and not into Susan's pocket or some arbitrary rule enforcement. The laughter of children playing by the water, the sight of retirees relaxing under the trees, and the sound of rods casting into the calm surface all painted a picture of a community reborn, not under the tyranny of the HOA, but under the fairness of a man who had simply wanted to fish in peace. Susan, on the other hand, was a shadow of her former self. With neighbors turning against her and whispers of petitions to dissolve the HOA growing louder, she spent her days in bitter isolation, furious that her iron grip had been broken. She had underestimated David, written him off as powerless, and in doing so had set into motion the very downfall of her empire. David, meanwhile, took no pleasure in her misery. He didn't need to. His victory was not in her downfall, but in his rise. On one particularly golden evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the lake in shimmering hues of orange, David stood on the shore, watching children run along the banks, their laughter ringing through the air. A neighbor approached him, one of the very men who had once voted to fine him, and offered a handshake. "You changed everything here, David," he admitted quietly. "You gave us back our community." David accepted the gesture with a simple nod, his expression calm but his heart swelling with quiet pride. He had not set out to be a leader, but circumstances had thrust him into the role, and he had risen to the challenge. From that day on, he wasn't just the man who owned the lake, he was the man who reminded his neighbors what freedom looked like, a man who had turned humiliation into triumph. The HOA's reign was effectively over, and though Susan still clung to scraps of control, everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the board dissolved entirely. The true authority of the neighborhood now sat with David, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it. The story of the black man who had been fined for fishing, only to turn the tables by buying the very lake, spread far beyond the neighborhood, inspiring others who had been bullied by HOAs or oppressive institutions to stand tall. David had become a legend in his own right, proof that dignity and resilience could not be fined away, and that sometimes the quietest man in the room could end up owning everything.